Today we'll be talking about Chapter 10 from the AMSCO AP European History textbook. Chapter 10 is the Age of Reason, or the Enlightenment. Last week we talked about the Scientific Revolution, which was the end of Chapter 1. The Enlightenment kind of continues that same story, but applying these new ways of thinking, scientific method, inductive and deductive reasoning, rather than applying it to science and to the universe, applying it to our own lives, to society, government, and religion. So we'll see a lot of similarities between the Scientific Revolution and the Enlightenment. When we talk about the Enlightenment, in terms of the context, what was going on at the time, the Scientific Revolution immediately leads to the Enlightenment. Now, remember, the Scientific Revolution was not one event. It was not one time period. Rather, the Scientific Revolution took place over 200 years. Copernicus published his heliocentric theory in 1453. Galileo did his research in 1600. Isaac Newton did his work in 1700. So actually, that's a 250-year time frame. But the Scientific Revolution led to lots of new ways of thinking. The scientific method of basing your conclusions based off of observations and evidence, what you can actually observe rather than just logic or what the church tells you. Using reason, thinking things through, collecting data, observations, doing experiments. And all of that in the Scientific Revolution challenged traditional ideas and challenged traditional sources of knowledge. Traditionally, people trusted either the church or they trusted the Greeks, classical culture. With the Scientific Revolution, people are now more open-minded to challenge those traditional ideas. Scientific Revolution also created a culture of academia. We talked about scientists working together with these academic societies, oftentimes funded by the king. And then a culture of math and of science, which had also kind of started during the Renaissance. So let me start to plug in some notes here, then we'll get into the actual Enlightenment. So with the context here, the Scientific Revolution leads to the Enlightenment. Remember, when we talk about the Scientific Revolution, there's a focus on reason. I'm going to bold that word because it's super important. Scientific method, deductive reasoning, and I'm going to throw in one more word, empiricism. Those all mean the same thing. Scientific method, deductive reasoning, empiricism. It's all about observation, data, experiments. And all of this, remember, challenges traditional sources of authority, which, remember, that was typically the church and the Greeks or classical culture. While the Scientific Revolution took place over 200 or 250 years all throughout Europe, the Enlightenment was much more specifically mid-1700s, 1730s to 1770s maybe, and it was centered in Paris, France. So again, the Scientific Revolution was all over. Copernicus was Polish, Galileo was Italian, Newton was British. The Enlightenment, that's in France, that's in Paris. And what it does is it applies the ideas of the Scientific Revolution, specifically reason, to all areas of life. Science, sure, but also religion, politics, society, education. And the big idea, as it says there, is that the general belief that human progress is possible. You might be thinking that sounds kind of familiar, sounds kind of like humanism. And so if you really dig into kind of the flow of new ideas, humanism leads to the Scientific Revolution, which leads to the Enlightenment. You see this progression of ideas during the 1400s, 1500s, 1600s, and now 1700s. Now, the scientists or philosophers of the Enlightenment, they were called philosophes, just the French word for philosopher. If you call them philosopher, that's fine. And there's quite a few important ones. John Locke is the first really important Enlightenment philosopher. He actually wasn't part of the Enlightenment. He wrote in the 1600s in England, but his ideas are going to be super influential. John Locke had a few key ideas. First, he believed in something called tabula rasa, which literally means blank slate. John Locke believed that when humans are born, they are born as a blank slate. They are not born with any knowledge or any morals or values. Rather, What makes humans what they are is how they're raised, their upbringing, society around them, and their education. And so John Locke came to realize, okay, humans are born as a blank slate. Humans are born as naturally good and naturally pure. And it's society that shapes humans to be what they are. So if a human grows up in a corrupt, immoral society, then that human will become corrupt and immoral. Or, as John Locke proposes, if a country really invests in education, educating the youth, then we can raise our future generations to be educated and moral and good, virtuous human beings. John Locke also believed in natural rights. He believed that it was the government's job to protect our natural rights, life, liberty, and property, or in the US Declaration of Independence, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And so John Locke was incredibly influential, inspiring the Glorious Revolution. The English Bill of Rights is basically John Locke's idea. You might remember Thomas Hobbes challenged John Locke's idea. Thomas Hobbes said that we need a monarch to keep us in check. Life is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Humans are selfish and greedy, so we need a monarch to keep us in check. But John Locke's really the important name here that we have to know. Now, those ideas continue to be developed in the mid-1700s in France by these philosophers, these philosophers. And some key names that you need to be familiar with, and I'll highlight 3 of these that I think are most important, maybe. Voltaire. Voltaire believed in religious toleration. Voltaire makes an argument that religious differences, religious conflict has caused countless wars throughout history. Religious tolerance has never actually caused any conflicts, though. And so if we want to create a more perfect society, a more peaceful world, religious tolerance is the way to go. Baron de Montesquieu came up with the idea of separation of powers, or checks and balances. The basic idea that you should not give all of the power in a government to one person. Rather, you should separate that power into 3 groups. In England, that would be king, parliament, and the courts. In the United States, that would be the president, Congress, and the Supreme Court. Best way to think of Montesquieu, think of how many syllables are in Montesquieu. Montesquieu, 3 syllables. He believes in 3 branches: president, Congress, and the courts. That's a way to prevent absolute monarchs. And then Jean-Jacques Rousseau is the other really famous one. Jean-Jacques Rousseau believed in the social contract. Rousseau believed in a democracy. He basically said, people give their power to the government. In return, the government must serve what the people's needs are. Think of a contract in business. If you hire someone to fix up your yard, what are you giving them? You give them your money, and they're supposed to do their job. They're supposed to do X, Y, and Z and fix up your yard or whatever. Now, the social contract continues that premise. If you pay them your money and they don't do the job, you can fire them, you can sue them, whatever. Same thing with government. If the people give a government their power and the government abuses their rights or does not serve the people, as the Declaration of Independence says, if the government becomes corrupt, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish and to institute new government. If the government becomes corrupt, the people have the right to rebel and to change the government. So the government serves the people. And so when we're talking about some of these key philosophers or key philosophs, John Locke, again, technically he's before the Enlightenment, but he fits here. Tabula rasa, that's blank slate. The government must protect natural rights. And then related to the idea of tabula rasa is the importance of education. Voltaire is another key one. He believes in religious toleration. Montesquieu believes in separation of powers. Those 3 branches. Remember, 3 syllables in Montesquieu, 3 branches. And then Rousseau believes in the social contract, which means the government must serve the people. Now, there's some other names there. Cesar Beccaria believed in fair punishment, no cruel or unusual punishments. He advocated getting rid of the death penalty. Diderot wrote the first encyclopedia, which basically applied reason to all aspects of life. But I'm going to say these 3 are probably the most important philosophers. And again, what they're doing is they're applying reason, they're applying the scientific method to the world around them. Now, these Enlightenment ideas very quickly spread, at least throughout France. And they spread in a couple of different ways. First, through salons, and then through coffee houses and the book trade. Salons, I mean, if you think in Spanish, salon is like a room, like a banquet hall or something like that. So a French salon would be a discussion group. It would be a room where wealthy, educated, white French men and French women would go to discuss the latest essay by Jean-Jacques Rousseau or John Locke or whoever. Salons, again, were really just for the upper class, just for the wealthy. But interestingly enough, salons were almost always hosted by women, hosted by wealthy women. And so these Enlightenment ideas spread very quickly in these French salons where the wealthy upper class could discuss these ideas and share essays. But this was also an opportunity for women to have a new role, I suppose, in hosting these meetings. And so women are able to be part of these conversations, which is significant. Now, if you're not a wealthy nobleman or upper class, but you're middle class, you would go to a coffee house instead to hear these ideas. You might remember when you all read A History of the World in 6 Glasses, one of the sections was all about coffee and how coffee houses were very famous during the Enlightenment, where people could discuss these ideas. So if you're a middle class person, you might learn about these ideas in a coffee house. And then in general, because of the printing press, all of these essays are able to be published and distributed, mostly for the middle class, again, because the working class isn't going to waste their money on a book of essays, but still, middle class is able to read these ideas. And so with the rise of the printing press, with the rise of the book trade, literally people buying books, there's a huge increase in the literacy rate. Way more people can read. That's a huge, when we're talking about the social effects of the Enlightenment, social effects, more people can read, increased education. There are daily newspapers. I want to say London was the first city in the world that had a daily newspaper, or essays, but also novels, stories that were especially popular with women, and then the encyclopedia that Diderot wrote. So again, when we talk about the spread of Enlightenment ideas, salons, this was hosted by women, and this is for the wealthy. We have coffee houses for middle-class men. And then we have the printing press, which leads to increased literacy rates, education, and as we saw with John Locke up here, education is a huge component of the Enlightenment, so it fits. Now, a lot of the Enlightenment focused on politics and society, but many of these philosophers also thought about religion. One of the seeming contradictions of both the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment, lots of people at the time thought that these philosophers were atheists, that they were saying God doesn't exist, that they were criticizing God. But yet, most of these Enlightenment philosophers were actually deeply religious. Almost none of them were atheist. They just believed in a different type of religion. And so the religion of the Enlightenment came to be something called Deism. I always like to describe this as God as a clockmaker. Imagine God built a perfect clock. He set up all of the gears. He set the pendulum to swing at this, perfect rhythm. He sets up the whole clock. It's mathematically perfect. And then he closes the door and walks away. This is Deism. This is the idea of God as a clockmaker. God created the clock. God created these perfect mathematical laws. The universe is perfect because God is perfect. God created the laws of gravity, the laws of motion that Isaac Newton discovered. But God walked away from the clock. He's not interfering in our everyday lives. Like, he created the universe perfectly, great, but he's not listening to our prayers necessarily. He's not going to intervene in our lives on a daily basis. This is both empowering if you are a Christian, because it proves, or not proves, but it validates the idea that God created the universe and created us and gave us the gift of reason. And it's also empowering. It's empowering for faith. It validates their faith, but it also validates their power as human beings, as men and women, because it says God gave us free will. God gave us reason. And we can use those gifts of God, free will and reason, to create a better world. It's not God who's going to save us, it's up to us. God's not going to make the world a better place. We have to. And so this is really this focus on reason, this focus on progress. So I'm actually going to put this up here with the key philosophers. So Deism was kind of the religion of the Enlightenment. We have this metaphor of God as a clockmaker. Whoops, what am I doing? And then again, really this focus on reason and free will. And perhaps on human progress or human potential. Again, a humanist idea as well from the Renaissance. Now, oftentimes with these cultural changes, it's mostly just men who are being affected, but women played a role as well. Now, most philosophers, to be fair, still believe that women were inferior to men. Those traditional gender hierarchies are still mostly there, but these notions do begin to be challenged. Jean-Jacques Rousseau was kind of the old-fashioned idea. Remember, Jean-Jacques Rousseau had this really groundbreaking idea of the social contract, democracy. The government has to serve the people. But when it came to the rights of women, Rousseau was very backwards. Rousseau said that nature gave power to man, and that the woman's natural role is to be a servant of man, and that a woman's only job is to be an object of desire, I think was the word that he used. But other philosophers came to challenge that traditional idea. Marquis de Concordet said we should not exclude women because they have the same right of reason and free will as men, so therefore they have natural rights. And most famously, Mary Wollstonecraft, who is a British philosopher in the late 1700s, argued that women are not born inferior, rather women are made inferior by the patriarchy. Patriarchy means like the male-run society or world or government. Mary Wollstonecraft says the reason why women are inferior is because men made us that way, because men gave us an inferior education. Men treated us as less than. Men gave us fewer opportunities. But if men were to give women equal opportunities, equal education, that would benefit everyone. And so some famous quotes. Mary Wollstonecraft wrote an essay called Vindication of the Rights of Women. This was in response to the Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen in France that we'll get to in chapter 8. And Mary Wollstonecraft says, girls and boys would play harmlessly together if the distinction of sex was not instilled in them long before nature makes any difference. Meaning, when girls and boys are kids, when they don't know the difference between sex, between male and female, everything's equal. It's society that says that women are inferior. She continues and says, if men would generously snap our chains and be content with rational fellowship instead of slavish obedience, men would find us more observant daughters, more affectionate sisters, more faithful wives, more reasonable mothers, in a word, better citizens. If men snapped the chains of women, if men freed women, women would be better daughters, better sisters, better wives, better citizens. It would help everyone if women were given an equal chance. She says, from the tyranny of man, I firmly believe the greater number of female follies proceed. The reason why women are foolish, the reason why women are inferior is because of the tyranny of man, because men give women fewer opportunities, less education. And she finishes her essay by writing, I do not wish them to have power over men, but over themselves. Saying, I don't want women to kill men. I don't want women to rule the world. I want women to have power over themselves. I want them to have free will, independence, the same natural rights that men have. She's arguing for the equal rights. This is really the first feminist, the first person fighting for women's rights. So I'm going to throw some of these ideas out again in our key philosophers. Mary Wollstonecraft. She fights for women's rights, and she says that men, I'm actually going to use the line she uses, the tyranny of man makes woman inferior. And so men need to help women rise up and become more equal. All right. The last big idea of the Enlightenment is the application of these Enlightenment ideas on governments, on monarchs. Now, it might seem kind of weird because when you look at a lot of these ideas, I mean, when you look at the ideas of, when you look at the ideas of John Locke, this sounds like democracy. Jean-Jacques Rousseau sounds like democracy. Montesquieu sounds like democracy. Mary Wollstonecraft sounds like she's arguing for democracy. But actually, the most popular type of government that the philosophes supported was Enlightened Absolutism. This was kind of the preferred government of the philosophes. To be enlightened, I didn't even define this word, I'm sorry. Think about in a cartoon, if a light bulb pops up on top of a character's head in a cartoon, that means they've got some new idea. And so to be enlightened, that means you're wise, you are sophisticated, you're intelligent, you've got a new idea. And so Enlightened Absolutism is the idea that, okay, we should have absolute monarchs, but they should use their power to do good. And so Catherine the Great is one fantastic example of this. She builds orphanages and schools and hospitals in Russia. Frederick the Great in Prussia does very similar things. He has religious toleration. He treats peasants fairly. And he says that I am the first servant of the state, this idea that I have to serve the people. And so just to clarify, democracy was rare at the time. We'll dig into the first European attempt to create democracy in the French Revolution. So most people preferred Enlightened Absolutism. If you can remember Catherine the Great's name, she's probably the most important, I think. That's in Russia. That would be a great example of Enlightened Absolutism. And so as we wrap up our discussion on Chapter 10, the Age of Reason and the Enlightenment, remember, in terms of historical context, all of our ideas are flowing together. The Renaissance led to the scientific revolution, which led to the Enlightenment. The Renaissance is focused on humanism, on human potential, human progress. We see that in the Enlightenment. The Renaissance is focused on math. We see in the Enlightenment. And then the scientific revolution is focused on reason and the scientific method. That's what the Enlightenment philosophers are doing. They're studying history, they're studying politics, they're studying governments, just like a scientist would study the world or the heavens. So there's a huge focus on reason, a huge focus on the scientific method, and they're applying these ideas, they're applying these ways of thinking, reason, scientific method, observation, data, experiments, applying that to government, to religion, to education, and to laws, such as trying to say that there should be no torture. And so just to, again, to emphasize this, key ideas here, we have this flow of ideas from the Renaissance to the scientific revolution, to the Enlightenment. There's a focus on reason, there's a focus on the scientific method, and it applies reason to all parts of life: politics, religion, education, the role of woman, etc. And so, like always, take a second and copy down these notes if you need to. Seems like I got everything on this slide. And when we continue, after Thanksgiving break, we'll talk about the French Revolution, how the people of France were inspired by these ideas and attempted to rebel to create their own more equal, more democratic government.